This evening, we're going to be talking about spiritual practices. The subtitle is Exploring Questions, Longings, Resistance, and Presence. And as Gail and I were deciding on a theme, we kind of felt to this one because it included so much of the spectrum of what happens in us when we explore this topic together. So I'm really grateful that you've invited me here to talk about spiritual practices, which is one of my favorite topics. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Harmon McLaughlin, and I serve Community of Christ as Spiritual Formation Specialist and Director of the Spiritual Formation and Companioning Program. And so it is a great joy to be able to be here with you to share in this topic together. This will be the first of 2 sessions, and tonight will be a little bit more presentation. We'll take some time every now and then to pause and see if there are questions or comments or shared experiences. And the next time we gather, will be much more participatory. We'll be sharing in several spiritual practices together and having an opportunity to process our experiences and to ask questions about the nature of those practices. So I am sure that there is a spectrum of familiarity with spiritual practices, and my hope is that wherever you find yourself on the spiritual journey, there will be something of value in these reflections for you tonight. So first, I'd like to begin with a spiritual practice, which is called breath prayer. And this is one of the easiest, simplest practices I know that can be done anywhere at any time. And so as we begin this exploration, it feels appropriate that we would ground our own selves, our whole beings, in that God to which we come when we engage in a spiritual practice. So I'll invite you first to just notice how it is you come. Notice your physical presence and posture. If there is a different way that you'd like to sit to feel more receptive, feel free to do that. If it's helpful, you may choose to close your eyes. And begin simply by breathing. Don't worry too much about trying to control or manipulate your breath. Just gently notice each inhale and exhale. Pay attention for a few moments to this gift of life. Divine breath breathing through you here and now. And as you start to settle into a time of receptivity to God, I invite you in each inhale to silently, with your breath, use a name for God. So it could be God, Holy Spirit, Holy One, Source of Peace, Creator, whatever name for God is present within you today. And on each exhale, a simple prayer of longing. Perhaps it's thank you, or help, or fill me, open me. Notice what comes to your heart as you name God, and notice that prayer that you will use on the exhale. So for each inhale, Holy One, exhale, fill me. Or each inhale, Creator God, and exhale, sustain me. Don't worry too much about coming up with the right words. Just notice what comes to mind for you, and then we'll take just a few moments in the silence to let our breath follow the rhythm of these words as they lead us deeper into a time of prayer and openness to the God who is with us here and now. As you continue to breathe and pray, notice if at some point you desire to let the words just fall away and to find yourself open and present before the one who is already present with you. Take a few more deep breaths. As you are ready, bring your awareness back to this community of friends gathered here today. Breath prayer feels like a really appropriate way to begin. It reminds us of the intimacy, the immediacy of connection with God. Today, we're going to be spending time talking about why we might engage in spiritual practices at all. And just a note of reference for us at the beginning of this 2-week exploration is that I will be using the terms prayer and spiritual practice somewhat interchangeably. In all of my study and experience, I have found that there is really very little distinction between these two terms, except that I would describe prayer as essentially about our relationship with God, and spiritual practice as the form or structure that prayer takes. But all spiritual practice is prayer, and it is all about relationship with God. Through my experience as a spiritual director, retreat facilitator, spouse, daughter, sister, minister, and human being, the one thing that I am constantly convinced of is that there is always more at work in each of us than we may ever realize. We frequently live on the surface of our awareness, but deep within us is this vast interior life that is always beckoning us with the purpose of wholeness and oneness in God. Martin Laird urges us that these depths must be explored, for they bottom out in God, the depthless depth that is the ground of all. Sometimes we catch glimpses of these deep, wordless places in us. These glimpses can be peaceful and affirming, full of divine presence, or sometimes unsettling and disruptive as they rub against the edges of our status quo that we try desperately to maintain. However they arrive, their source is always love, which is probably why most of us have at some level a basic desire for meaning in our lives, a sense that there is a something more that is calling to us and that it is good. Spiritual practices are like windows into this vast interiority within us. They assist us in becoming more awake and alive to the God who is already the ground of our being. This might be a tricky concept to wrap our hearts and minds around, because many of us have grown up with God images that might feel very remote, distant, or patriarchal. But it is actually very faithful to Christianity to image God as reality itself, or in the words of Paul in Acts 17, as the one in whom we live and move and have our being. Or, as in Genesis 2, the one who breathed and breathes life continually within us. These are images of intimacy and immediacy that affirm to us that no matter how far we might feel from God, even if all of the images of God we've previously relied on are in rubble around us, there is a God beyond our ideas of God, who is infinitely vast and immanently present, as close as our being and breath. And so again, in the words of Martin Laird, God does not know how to be absent. The very nature of God is presence. And similarly, Gerald May, who is a spiritual director and psychologist, says, our minds like to put reality in compartments, with God there and we here and the rest of the world somewhere else. Sometimes we just have to remind ourselves that God's presence is not reserved for any particular space. Though we may be more aware of God's presence in one place than another, we need to remember that wherever we look, wherever our attention goes, God is there. This is an important place to start because spiritual practices are ultimately ways of being in relationship with this God. They are meant to wake us up little by little and help us stay more awake each day to the sacred nature of all reality. A spiritual practice can be just about anything practiced with attention and intention. So hiking, for example, without intention and attention is a great fun activity. But one misconception that I often hear is that if we are just simply doing things we enjoy, we are praying, and so we don't need to be disciplined in other ways. Prayer can happen in these moments of enjoyment. It can happen when the Spirit catches our awareness and draws our attention. But hiking or anything else that we enjoy is a spiritual practice when we intentionally choose to be in relationship with God through that practice and turn our attention to God as the source of that prayer. So this really opens it up for us that just about anything in our lives can be a spiritual practice. But it is, as Brother Lawrence describes for us, an opportunity to practice the presence of God in all things. Is this activity something that is drawing my heart deeper in awareness of the divine nature of reality around me. There are many kinds of spiritual practices to try, from classical spiritual disciplines such as the prayer of examen and Lectio Divina and centering prayer. And then there's also the everyday life kind of stuff, like holy attention in the grocery aisle, or eating mindfully, or walking in nature, or talking to a friend, or even listening more deeply to someone that we struggle to understand. Other wise voices can help us understand the nature of spiritual practice, and see if any of these definitions resonate for you. From Jane Vinard, spiritual practices are those ways of seeing and being in the world that help us wake up and become fully, truly alive. Or from Ruth Haley Barton, she reminds us that we cannot transform ourselves, or anyone else for that matter. What I can do, she says, is create the conditions in which spiritual transformation can take place by developing and maintaining a rhythm of spiritual practices that keep me open and available to God. And then Adele Calhoun from the Spiritual Disciplines Handbook writes, and I love this definition: spiritual disciplines give the Holy Spirit space to brood over our souls. Just as the Spirit hovered over the face of the deep at the dawn of creation, so God hovers over us today, birthing the ever-fresh Christ life within. And then finally, from Brian McLaren, spiritual practices are about life, about training ourselves to become the kind of people who have eyes and actually see, who have ears and actually hear, and so experience not just survival, but life. They are a way of locating ourselves in a present moment no less lighted by the presence of the unseen God, from who we come, to whom we go, and with whom we travel. Spiritual practices are ways of becoming awake and staying awake to God. So hopefully you're starting to see a theme here. None of these authors say spiritual practices only happen when we practice them exactly correctly and have the right structure and form. But they're all saying these are opportunities, these are ways of waking up to this presence of God that is already and always with us and in all things. What a powerful invitation. My own spiritual practices are varied, especially now that we're living in a global pandemic and I am a full-time working mother of a 2-year-old. I used to spend a lot of time each morning in silence, prayer, journaling, and spiritual reading. And that was time that I really cherished. Now it seems that my daughter can intuit when I will wake early and promptly begins calling for me as soon as the coffee brews. I know that to have the time my soul craves, I must be disciplined in waking up even earlier than she will wake me up. Some mornings I am more disciplined than others, but I can always feel the difference in myself when it's been a few days since I've really taken the time to re-encounter that source of my life. I have also found that different seasons of our lives bring different kinds of spiritual practices. And so there might be a practice that serves us well for a period of time. Like for me, it was an hour of solitude in the morning before I had a baby. And now that seems a little bit less likely on a regular basis. But other spiritual practices have emerged as meaningful, like singing my daughter to sleep with Taizé songs. And if you aren't familiar with Taizé, which I'm sure many of you are, simple, repetitive prayer songs that help ground us in that presence of God. My daughter also helps me wake up to the sacredness of the world and life through the practice of holy attention. As we walk together, I've noticed that children are naturally attentive and curious. And so while I am walking because I want exercise or I'm trying to get somewhere, she'll just suddenly stop because she wants to gaze a little longer at that line of ants marching from here to there, or to examine the veins of a leaf, or to gather rocks in our hands and stuff them in our pockets. These aren't classic spiritual disciplines, but they are ways of waking up to the sacred around me, and within my daughter. And when the moments open to engage in the kind of deeper prayer my soul yearns for, I drink deep of that experience, even if my prayer is short or simple or mundane. I find that the best spiritual practices for personal practice are simple, especially if you are just getting started. When we are trying to remember all the right steps, sometimes the experience of the practice can get lost in trying to get the mechanics right. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to start with this foundation rather than just diving into trying some different practices together. I'll also suggest that whether you are a seasoned or new practitioner, that you give yourself time and lots of grace. Spiritual practice is always about the intention of our hearts, and it's okay if we miss a step in the prayer of examine now and then. Centering prayer is another example of a practice that is simple but can at first seem intimidating to many, especially because the recommendation is that you are in silence for 20 minutes, which for some of us can feel like an eternity. But please feel the freedom that if you do decide to try that practice, you can start with whatever amount of silence feels natural to you. I love centering prayer because it is one of the simplest forms of prayer there is. But I will confess to you that I spent years not understanding centering prayer. I kept thinking that there was something I was missing. I kept thinking, surely there is more to this prayer than just being present before God. But it is the pure simplicity of presence before God that is at the heart of this practice. And I realized as I was getting started how out of practice I was with simply being present to God as I am, as God is. In centering prayer, you simply find a prayer word, grace, peace, love, God, and gradually wake up to God's presence here and now. You don't need to say anything. The goal is actually to just be present to the God who is beyond words, images, and ideas. To gently acknowledge and release distractions when they arise by returning to your breath and your prayer word. Experienced practitioners know that distractions will arise. It's not a sign that you have failed at prayer. It is the practice itself, a continual invitation to return to the intention to be present to God as the source of our lives. Henry Nouwen describes the importance of wasting time with God in prayer. And Evelyn Underhill says, the true contemplative, coming to this plane of utter stillness, does not desire extraordinary favors and visitations, but the privilege of breathing for a little while the atmosphere of love. Just take in that invitation. We've become so accustomed to assume that if we don't feel something extraordinary, we must not be doing prayer correctly. Yet we all know that the best relationships offer us the simplicity of just feeling at home, of breathing for a little while the atmosphere of love. And if we are moved or receive inspiration or feel that special presence of peace, we can give thanks. But the feeling itself is not the point of the prayer. The point of the prayer is to be present to the God who is beyond, but also part of all feelings. My own prayer life deepened profoundly when I began to realize and incorporate this insight. I find that this practice, centering prayer, is especially helpful for people who aren't so sure about God right now. You don't have to know who or what God is to make yourself available to sacred mystery for whatever it will be, and to rest or wrestle in the silence. Regardless of which spiritual practice you try, what most people want to talk about is whether or not they have been successful at connecting with God. And often we put an enormous amount of pressure on ourselves to have a good experience in prayer or spiritual practice. Even many of us who lead corporate spiritual practice or worship or other events for our faith community might feel that same pressure that it's only successful if people have cried, or it's only successful if people come away with that really good, warm feeling. And that is definitely something to savor, but that is not the totality of who God is for us. I think many of us are so conditioned from being in cultures of immediate gratification and consumption that we expect to get something from everything, and we associate good feelings with successful or meaningful experience. Yet deepening in the life of prayer through spiritual practices will produce a whole range of inner movements in us that are all normal, from joy and connection to boredom and restlessness, sometimes even resistance and agitation. As a spiritual director, I am always listening to what others describe either happened or did not happen in their life of prayer and spiritual practice. When I hear someone say, "Well, nothing happened for me in that time of prayer," I am always curious about the nothing. Could you describe it? Did it feel like emptiness, distance, dryness, barrenness, restlessness, boredom? If it was dryness, for example, tell me more. What felt dry in you as you were in prayer? What might the dryness be revealing about what you are truly thirsting for? What is the invitation of the Spirit for you in this simple sacred awareness? On the screen, you will see a list of just a few of the normal experiences people have in everyday spiritual practice. And I invite you to take a moment to glance through this list of words and just notice if you have ever had a moment of prayer or spiritual practice where you felt any of these things. Once we begin to recognize that God is not waiting for us on the other side of these experiences, but is right in the midst of them, we become open to that intimate texture of all the Spirit is doing within us, and God becomes even more available and abundant than we had previously perceived. If I am open to listening within, I can always learn something about myself and God from my time of prayer, even if it is complete resistance, which I will confess occurs frequently. Sometimes I'll be in prayer and I don't know if you've ever had an experience like this where you just feel yourself kind of fighting even the time to be present. And in those moments, rather than thinking, wow, I'm really bad at praying, I turn that same loving, curious gaze to my own inner life. I take a breath and I ask, why am I feeling this resistance to prayer today? Am I tired, burnt out? Is something deeper going on in me that is gently calling my attention? Maybe this form of prayer isn't what I need right now. Maybe I need to take a walk or just breathe or come back later when I feel more open. It's in the noticing when we are open and closed, available or distant, that is part of the value of spiritual practice. We are learning about our habitual ways of encountering and resisting divine love that is always present to us. You'll notice on the screen the quote by Christine Walters Paintner. Does my inner work cultivate in me a wider heart and capacity to be present? We are learning about and experiencing greater wakefulness. And to me, this is one of the core values of spiritual practice. All the Christian mystics say that this is the marker of authentic spiritual experience. Does it widen my heart, deepen my compassion, strengthen my connections? Does it bring the disparate pieces of my life together into lived integrity? This is what spiritual practices cultivate in us over time. As we spend time listening deeply to the movements of the Spirit happening in us, we become more awake and attuned to the movements and nuances of the Spirit everywhere around us, in everyone and in everything. Walter Burghardt says, contemplation is a long, loving look at the real. I'm learning in gratitude that prayer is about bringing my whole life into the presence of God who is already here. We practice waking up to the sacredness of life and the world around us. Every deep experience I've had in prayer has drawn me closer in connection with God and others. The experience of union that the mystics talk about is not just with God, but with all creation. When we begin to explore this vast inner landscape within, we discover that its very ground is our core identity as beloved and inextricably connected in God with all life. And it seems that our world needs people dedicated to spiritual practice now more than ever, to practice being more awake to ourselves, to God and others, to be more human and humble, more open-hearted and willing to listen, more open to wisdom from a deeper source than our own ideologies or opinions. Especially as I review in the context of my current national situation, as mass protests are happening in almost every city and town because of racial injustice, I am aware that spiritual practice is not a privilege or a luxury for people of faith. It is a necessity. It is a habit and a tool of reflection that invites us to see who we truly are before God and who all others truly are too. It transcends and transforms our personal ideologies, agendas, prejudices, opinions to reveal God's much deeper vision and larger love. Authentic practice always invites some kind of contemplative action in the world. This can mean protest, study, raising our children to be kind-hearted, being mindful about our encounters and assumptions with others, especially those who are different from us. Joan Chittister is a Benedictine nun and renowned author, and she writes, "The function of prayer is to change my own mind, to put on the mind of Christ, to enable grace to break into me. It sees the whole world through incense, a holy place, a place where the sacred dwells, a place to be different by those who pray, a place where God sweetens living with the beauty of all life. Prayer leads us and leavens us and enlightens us and changes us. It makes us something bigger than we are." And this is a pretty bold but important statement she makes. Changes in attitude and behaviors are a direct outcome of prayer. Anything else is more therapeutic massage than confrontation with God. I'll let that settle for just a moment because that's a pretty bold statement from Joan Chittister. The deepest truths in us must be lived. Growing in attention to God as a daily habit, we begin to recognize that same Spirit in all places, people, and circumstances, and our vision of our everyday real lives in the world is transformed. Reflective action becomes more natural and integral to our sense of wholeness and well-being when we realize that we are not separate, but our welfare is bound inextricably in the welfare of every other creature. And this is what spiritual discipline is all about. It is not just a momentary feel-good experience to compartmentalize from the rest of life, though we give thanks when that Spirit of God does come in that way. But it is also a deep encounter with the living God who is the source of all, that continually transforms our lives and makes more possible a vision of the world where all life can flourish, be free, and know that they are loved. This is why in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness before he proclaims his mission to bring good news to the poor, to set the captives free, and to liberate the oppressed. He had to spend that much time with God to sift through all the voices in his life to discern that one voice. His time of prayer and practice was an integrating force that brought clarity and courage for his true call. And he returned often throughout Scripture to ground his action in the world in God as the source of who he was and what he did. Now more than ever, the world is yearning for disciples of depth and discipline who aren't torn by competing opinions and agendas, but are willing to ground their lives in the Spirit as the source of how they live with others. Mystics and prophets throughout the ages embody this same call. When things get hard and complex in our lives and in the contexts in which we live, spiritual practice is not a retreat from the world. It is an invitation to enter even more deeply reality, to see more clearly and honestly, to find that deeper calling within us. Henry Nouwen also captures the importance of spiritual practice for personal and global transformation when he writes, "The more we pray, in the sense of living a prayerful life, the more we desire to be with God in prayer. Prayer creates in us a hunger and thirst to be with the one whom we have seen shining through nature and moments in time, people, and events. When we turn our hearts to God in prayer, we will not only see ourselves as loved by God, but we will see other people in the light of God's great love. The heart of God is not only the place where we find our true selves, but also the place where we find men, women, and children of all times and places and discover they too are our brothers and sisters, loved as uniquely and completely as we are loved. In the heart of God, we find the true joy of being part of the human race. There we are truly connected, not only with God, but with ourselves and with one another. Spiritual practices bring peace, assurance, wisdom, growth in relationship with God, depth, integrity, courage, joy, justice, and hope. They comfort and confront. They bring ease and they unsettle. They wake us up to the living God who is doing a new thing in and around you even now. They liberate us to become who we truly are and help us grow daily into who we yearn to become. Next week, we'll be looking specifically at some spiritual practices and having an opportunity to dive deeply together and explore our responses and to ask questions. In just a moment, I'll pause and see if there are any reflections or responses that have been evoked for you as we have shared together in this foundation of why spiritual practice matters. But my hope for you is that you can find or continue a spiritual practice that also helps you become more awake. Awake to who you really are. Awake to the presence of God with you even now. Awake to that same presence everywhere you go in this beautiful, aching world. Whether it's something simple practiced with intention and attention, or a classic spiritual discipline whose rhythm speaks to your soul. However you practice and whatever you practice, my prayer is that you too may discover the God who is already here and in every place you will ever be, waiting to welcome you with unconditional love and grace. And so I'll close this part of the sharing with a quote by Gerald May, and then I'll give us just a moment to absorb and to notice what's been moving in us and an opportunity to reflect in community together. Gerald May says, remember that any prayer you might say consciously is but a wave on the surface of the great prayer being prayed deeply in you by the source of love every moment of your life. So I'll invite you now to again return to your breath after you've received a lot of information and reflection. And to just notice for a few moments in the silence, in your listening and reflecting on your own experience, what did you hear that shimmered for you? What drew your attention that you resonated with or would like to explore more? What did you hear that shimmered for you? What captured your attention that aligns with your experience or that you would like to learn about more?